The subject of Alternative Views News Magazine for the evening is boy prostitution, the widespread use and abuse of male children for sexual purposes. Some of the language in the program may be offensive to some people. Admittedly, the whole subject is offensive.
In 1979, there was a call boy ring operated out of New York City, which had phone hookups with Houston, Atlanta, Los Angeles, New Orleans, Washington, D.C. And that call boy ring had a list of 10,000 clients who could call and with a credit card purchase a boy. Hello?
Hello, this is credit card number 06789. I'd like to make an order, please.
Go ahead.
I'm looking for a young male, blonde hair, blue eyes.
Body hair or no body hair?
Thick body hair, please.
What age?
10 to 12.
Butch or femme?
Butch, please.
What is your address?
I'm at the Houston Marriott Hotel, room 313.
Wire me $200 now by credit card and have $100 in cash for the boy. He'll be there in 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
In Houston, I give the figure based on, I think, prudent calculations that upwards of 350 boys a year are killed deliberately because of this. Many more die of drug overuse, malnutrition, of suicide. The national toll per year is in the thousands every year. Kids die violently because of this. It's closely attached to the major financial, commercial, industrial, educational institutions of our society. It's run by the same people who run those. It's frequented by the same people who occupy management positions in those. It's not the mafia. It's an adjunct of clean business. It's serving the most respectable people we have in our society, the people who are the elite.
Prostitution of male children tonight on Alternative Views News Magazine. Tonight's program on Alternative Views is one which you may quite frankly not want to watch. It's going to be very disturbing. The subject is very controversial, even disgusting. The language in some of them may be offensive to some people. But we're going to find out tonight about the seamier side of the American power structure and maybe something about male Homo sapien. Because the subject of tonight's program is boys for sale, boy prostitution. Where these kids come from, how they're used, how they're abused, tortured, killed, used sexually, and who is it that's doing it? We find some very shocking things are happening. We have with us Tom Philpott, the History Department of the University of Texas, is a special guest, and in addition, Mark McKinnon, former editor of the Daily Texan at the university. Tom has been doing a lot of research on the subject, and Mark was involved in some articles, very controversial articles, a couple of years ago.
But before we have our program on boy prostitution, here are some news stories.
And that's our news segment this evening. Now let's turn to our main focus, boy prostitution. Well, I'm drained already after talking to you people for a couple of days about this subject. I'm absolutely shocked, and I feel degraded too as a member of the human race. Tom, can you first give a case history? Just kind of a typical case history, and then we'll talk in greater detail about what happens.
All right, I can tell you the biography of a little kid from a hollow in West Virginia whose mom and dad went to Houston to find work. They thought that Houston was the capital of opportunity in America. The dad went out there to get a job, a low-level job with an oil company, brought the mother, then sent for little Jimmy and his little brother. Jimmy and his brother got to Houston on a Greyhound bus, and his dad and mom failed to pick him up.
How old were they?
Jimmy at that time was 12 and his little brother was 6. They spent the night in the terminal, Jimmy fending off the advances of a number of men. And then the dad came to pick him up the next morning. The parents had both gotten drunk and forgotten to pick up the kids. The boys went to live with their parents. The parents both had severe drinking problems. The dad lost his job. The mother got killed in a car wreck. The little boy was severely injured. Jimmy dropped out of school to try to hustle, was his word, money to help keep the family, what was left of it, together. The dad died, choking in his own vomit after a drinking bout. And Jimmy was the sole support of himself and his little brother. The rent was coming round, and Jimmy had no money, and then a neighbor kid said to him, "You can get $10 just for watching me play with a man." And Jimmy said, "That's queer." And his friend said, "It's not queer if the guy does it to you. If you just let it happen, and all you have to do is watch." Jimmy did it. Then the man offered Jimmy $25 to let the man play with Jimmy, and Jimmy took it, so he had $35. And then he got introduced into the routine. Jimmy was little, only 12, and he was small for his age. And the circuit he went on in Houston was not the main one, which is Montrose. He went to a place nearby, an arcade called Funland. The way that worked was the boys would stand by the machines, and a man would come by. If the man offered quarters, the boy would take them, and then the man and the boy would go off. Jimmy became a professional prostitute at the age of 12. He survived in that capacity until he was 14.
Was he working on his own, or was he part of an organization?
He was not part of an organization. He was what they call the Farm League, and he was taking care of his little brother. His brother got killed in a car wreck when he was driving with some people, and Jimmy then was desolate and almost destitute. He used the last money he had to bury his brother. He did not want to let his last surviving relative, his grandpa in West Virginia, know the way things had gone. A reporter in Houston last saw Jimmy across the street from Funland, and a man who used to pay boys for sex then told this reporter, "I know that boy." He told a man who's a friend of mine that one time he was having sex with that little boy, and then he realized that the boy was crying, and he looked up and saw that the boy was sucking his own thumb, and at that point he had to break off the encounter. The journalist believes that this reformed man who used to use boys was his own best friend, the boy who had been having sex with Jimmy. Jimmy disappeared. His body was later found mutilated, and his grandfather was notified. The police then told the grandpa in a very cruel way that the grandpa shouldn't try to get a loan from the city of Houston. It would have cost $500
to ship the body back?
To ship the body to West Virginia, because the boy was nothing but a harbor whore, or worse. And the grandpa died shortly thereafter. The whole family is dead now. Jimmy was a typical kid. He wasn't looking for this life. He found it. He needed some means of support. He took what he could get, and he came to grief and met his death. Houston is possibly the worst city in the United States for the misuse of lost and runaway boys or homeless, defenseless boys. Probably 350 or more boys are killed every year in Houston.
About Houston? I would say I hear about Houston that it is the worst. That children are brought to Houston from places such as New Orleans or from other parts of the Southwest.
Their life is sad. It's 100% sad. They get up, 1 or 2 or 3 during the day, and they go out and they have to earn money, and they're treated bad. They eat only when they're fed by somebody else, and they never get anything for anything. They always have to return sexual favors for it. They sometimes get beaten, they get robbed, they get pushed. The police abuse them, everybody abuses them. One young man got out of a car. By young man, I mean the age of probably 15, maybe 16. And he got out of the car and he was just badly beaten. I mean, there's no two ways about it. He looked right at him and his face was black and blue and blood coming out of his nose and his lip was fat and he couldn't walk very well and he was sick to his stomach in the bushes and he was just very badly beaten. Evidently, he had got either a bad trick or the man was on S&M or something and just kind of like shoved him out of the car as he went around the corner. Opened the door for him and said, "Get out."
Any of them ever want to hurt you?
That's why I watch out for them.
Do you watch out for them?
Yeah.
How do you tell?
When they start to jump now.
What, jump on you?
Yeah, if they do, I'll be ready because I'll be watching every time.
What do you be doing then?
I just be laying down in bed, letting them suck and just watch them.
But if they start to jump on you, what can you do?
I always carry a pocket knife or something like that. I don't know if they hurt me or not. I just watch out for them, just in case they do start.
9 out of 10 of them are weird. I mean, they get, there was one guy that picked me up in Atlanta, and he just said that, he wanted somebody to go out and have a few beers when they would smoke a joint. And we got over there, and I was drinking this beer, and all of a sudden, doing like that, I couldn't even see straight. My eyes were rolling back. And then the room started spinning and I was out of it. When I came around, he had me tied up in the basement, no less. Way up like this, And I couldn't even move.
Did he tied up?
Yeah, stretched.
What was he doing to you?
Nothing. He was just sitting there with this whip looking like he was going to hit me with it. He just threatened me a lot, and I was sitting there crying and scared to death. Because the worst they could do is kill me,
That interview was conducted several months ago in Houston, Texas. Investigators now fear that the 15-year-old is dead. The body of a young man found ritualistically dismembered in Missouri is thought to be his.
I woke up and he was clamping handcuffs on me. I was laying on my stomach. The other two were on their stomach and they were handcuffed and their feet were tied.
The most shocking and horrifying result of older men having sex with young boys is the story of Dean Corll in Houston, Texas, and more recently John Gacy in Chicago. In Houston, Corll lured or had brought to his home at least 27 young boys, all under the age of 17. The boys were sexually assaulted, then killed.
In Houston, I give the figure based on, I think, prudent calculations that upwards of 350 boys a year are killed deliberately because of this. Many more die of drug overuse, malnutrition, of suicide. The national toll per year is in the thousands every year. Kids die violently because of this. In the first 3 months of this year, 1981, 30 boys were found dead in Houston. None of them was called a homicide. They were found to be dead of exposure, dead of causes undetermined, dead of massive internal bleeding, as in the case of one child under 10 who was found naked in a Dempsey dumpster with his colon and his rectum torn apart. He was called not a homicide, but a victim of massive internal injury.
He was fist raped.
Yes.
What is the sort of psychic roots or the nature of this phenomenon?
I've been studying this phenomenon since the spring of 1979, and to the best of my knowledge, most men who seek sex from boys are not homosexuals. To the extent that they have active sex lives at the peer level, they are heterosexual. Many of them have no peer sex at all. There are gay people who are what we call pederasts, that is, men who lust after children, especially boys. But it appears to be the case that most such men are not gay, that their attraction is for young, defenseless children, especially boys, because they're more exotic and more forbidden. But it is not a matter of gay rights as advocated by practically anybody. This is a much different sort of phenomenon. The reason that the gay community usually scorns any investigation of the subject is that they know that the average person in the public will blame homosexuals and homosexuality for the phenomenon, regardless of what facts are presented.
Well, this is not just a sexual thing in the way we talk about it. It's a power trip, and it's also a sadistic thing, because these kids are tortured and killed.
The kind of individuals involved are down the line, almost in every instance, in the cases I've investigated, men who are very powerful, usually very wealthy, and usually administrate control over a large number of people.
Wealthy Houstonians can and do obtain boys in a most discreet manner.
It's gotten a little more sophisticated now. It's gotten more expensive. Higher prices are paid, and it's gotten a little more sophisticated in terms of I think the types of people who are into it, types of adults who are into it, professional people.
Houston professional people?
Yeah.
Soliciting boys?
Oh, sure.
You know, I mean, you can be a millionaire in Houston, man. Yeah.
You got people here that are so wealthy that they can't let anybody know what they're doing, that they're willing to pay $200, $300, $400 a night, you know, for one of these boys not to say anything about them. You know, you got judges, doctors, lawyers, politicians, advertising people
involved in
buying young people, if it's for an hour, for a night, or for a month, or for a year. They actually have white slavery in this country. It's a fact. And in Houston, right now, it's going on.
Tom, is there any evidence that there's any connection with organized crime? Obviously, with other forms of prostitution that we know about, there are close connections. The mafia has always utilized prostitution as one of the pillars of its organizations and sources of its income. Is there any connection here that has been revealed with organized crime?
Yes, when we're talking about 400 kids on the street between 2 and 4 in the morning in a city like Houston, there's very little organization. There may be a runner or a pimp who's trying to squeeze the boys a little, but there's no big businessman running a sophisticated operation. But when there is a bookstore with 40 stalls, there's often a stable of boys. That's fairly good-sized business. And there's bigger business than that. That's the call boy operations, like this one we described with the 10,000 customers. That's big business, it's crime, it's organized, but it's not the mafia. It's the pillars of our society. There is big business, organized crime. It's sophisticated, it's closely attached to the major financial, commercial, industrial, educational institutions of our society. It's run by the same people who run those. It's frequented by the same people who occupy management positions in those. It's not the mafia. It's an adjunct of clean business. It's serving the most respectable people we have in our society, the people who are the elite.
I assume you can't name names at this particular time, but...
Not if people haven't been apprehended yet.
Right, okay. Are senators involved? U.S. senators and congressmen, do you suppose?
Let me give you some information here. Now, this is stuff that has come out of newspaper clippings. It has gotten far enough to get in the newspaper, even if it hasn't been followed up. This was potentially the biggest case of all.
That the one in New Orleans?
Yes, a New Orleans Boy Scout troop was busted for actually being a call boy ring of boy prostitutes. The man who was the leader of the Boy Scout troop was given 75 years in prison, and then he offered to tell a story. The story he told was that the congressional delegations from 2 states, one of which was Louisiana and one of which bordered Louisiana, and, as he put it, the entire hierarchy of one of the states, as far as top political posts, were all involved as customers of the little boys. And he said he was willing to name all the names. That was a UPI story of 26 November 1979, and he never talked again.
Is he in jail now? Is he in
he's
prison?
Still in jail. He said there was 1 U.S. senator and many congressmen.
Weren't there a couple actually right-wing, new right representatives, congressmen in Washington, who were actually found guilty of molesting?
Doug, I wish you were right. Yeah. Congressman Robert Bauman was apprehended in February of 1980 having sex with a 16-year-old boy. For some reason, no charges were brought until September 1980. At that point, the FBI and the U.S. Attorney made an agreement to keep all details of the account out of public records. The charges were dropped on Bauman's promise that he would take a drug or an alcoholic abuse treatment program. He continued in office and he ran for re-election. He was defeated, but he said he would go on to run again. William F. Buckley is one of his closest friends. They were co-founders of Young Americans for Freedom and the American Conservative Union. The way Buckley put it was this: it transpires that during alcoholic bouts he engages in homosexual acts. He went on to say there was a complaint filed by a 16-year-old boy. And then he went on to say Bauman should resign from Congress and resign from the positions in conservative organizations because he was an embarrassment. Bauman never went to trial. He didn't actually go to a formal pretrial hearing either. Then there was Texas Congressman Wyatt, who was caught, well, actually, I take it back. He was not caught. A juvenile reported that Wyatt had forced sex on him. Charges were never filed. That's a quote. Charges were never filed, despite the fact that the boy had filed a complaint. And Wyatt said he was going to run again. When it was published in the Austin paper that the complaint was not that he was drunk driving, but that he had forced sex on a juvenile male, he said he wouldn't run again. He was already in the alcohol rehabilitation program, so there was no trial, no pretrial hearing, no charges.
Wasn't there another ring of tour guides, boys as tour guides for congressmen?
Well, that you may be referring to the case of Representative Hinson, a Republican from Mississippi, who was found having sex with somebody in the men's room of the Longworth House office building. There are conflicting accounts. According to one account, he was having sex with a minor. According to another account, he was having sex with an adult. He said he was innocent, and he agreed to undergo alcohol abuse treatment, and he was not charged.
Well, there was some
the charges were dropped.
Well, what was the story about the young boys being tour guides for the Capitol? And this was also part of a little boy sex ring, and also some of it resulted in campaign contributions. I read that in an article.
That has to do with the state of Texas, as a matter of fact.
Texas.
And here's the way we can tell that story.
This is one you can't tell.
Well, this is one we can't. It got into the newspaper.
Yeah, I saw it in the newspaper.
But then it disappeared.
Oh.
What appeared in the newspaper was a boys' home run by a Texas state representative was being investigated for charge of abuse of the boys. The state representative said that there was no abuse. He claimed that his place could not be investigated by the state because it was private, like that of Reverend Roloff. The story died and didn't appear in the press anymore. The lead that produced the initial story was that representative took campaign contributions and then the contributors, as a reward, got to have sex with the boys in the home. And that he did this for more than himself, but for other representatives. That man is out of the state legislature.
So we've talked about legislators, congressmen,
a senator,
senators, people in the highest ranks of government at the state level. Now, are these just aberrations, or is this part of a widespread ongoing thing?
I think it's very widespread. And not just among powerful politicians. We've talked about politicians. But it seems to be the case that in all high-powered professions,
corporations now we're talking about too.
Corporations, medicine, law, even the university, not necessarily professions with bloated salaries, but prestige, some power, influence, and above all, pressure. The men involved are susceptible to this kind of deviation.
I'm working right now, like just, with the corporation. And
what's that? How's that work?
Well, when their executives or, their business people are in town, they're sent to our apartment and we entertain them while they're here.
Okay, what's that entertainment usually involve? What do they usually demand, or what do they want?
Well, it's all kinds of sex and perversions. There's no two alike. I've decided that. Everyone's in for something different, so I can't really stereotype the whole, situation.
All the men want different things?
Yeah, right. But we're usually in the passive side, and they're usually the dominant player.
He was a real old man.
How old a man?
Like about in his 60s, 70s.
What does he do at Grady Hospital?
He's one of them people that operates on people.
He's a what?
A doctor.
We've talked about those men who have achieved power, and also among those men who wanted it but didn't get it.
Mm-hmm.
Men like poor Gacy in Chicago, who killed at least 33 boys. He was not a well-to-do man, but he was a joiner. He paid high dues to join men's clubs. He paid $1,000 to join the President's Club so he could have dinner with Jimmy Carter. Instead, he had dinner with Mrs. Carter and had his picture taken with her. He was an upward striver. He killed at least 33 boys. He offered in his defense that he could not identify any of the 33 boys by face or by name because he had had sex with 1,500 different boys in the previous 5 years, 300 different kids a year, and most of them, as he said, were prostitutes. He didn't snatch them off the street. He went out and bought their services, and then he coerced them, as this lawyer in Washington says no one ever does. He made them captives and he killed them.
What about women in the positions of power in government? You don't find women involved in that?
Well, you don't find many women involved in positions of power in the American
Maybe that
system.
explains what appears to be the fact. Women don't do this to little girls. Heterosexual women, homosexual women don't do this to little girls.
Or little boys.
Or little boys. I mean, it happens, but it's not common, it's not ordinary, it's not a phenomenon. It isn't a threat. If you have a little girl and you have an adult female friend, you needn't have any apprehension. But if you have little kids who are boys, they are in more danger than the little girls today.
Why do you think there's so much violence caught up in this?
Investigations in other cities have shown that boys 13, 14, even younger are coerced into prostitution with threats of physical violence and are sometimes shipped across state lines, shipped to the older adult men who desire young boys for sexual acts. Occasionally, these boys' episodes with their older clients ends in physical violence. There are men who seek young boys to torture and sometimes to kill.
This phenomenon is not unique to America. It may not even be unique to advanced industrial urban societies. In the other places where it occurs, though, it doesn't seem to be attended by a high level of mayhemic violence. In the United States, it is.
In Islamic countries, for instance, prostitution with boys is a standard. I've been in Morocco and Algeria and observed this, and yet I've never heard any stories of violence being involved. In other words, it's an erotic phenomenon as opposed to this power or psychological.
Well, there are those who would have us believe that that is the case in America. Here, for instance, is an article written by a law professor in Washington, D.C., who was general counsel to the Metropolitan Police Department. This article was written in 1981. He says, if the boys are victims, it is largely in the technical sense. It is more accurate to characterize them as entrepreneurs who by and large understand their own motivations. They do it for money, for drugs, for pleasure, and perhaps for some as a crude gambit for emotional sustenance. But unlike teenage girl prostitutes, they do not act out of fear. There is no coerced recruitment, no whippings, no incarcerations in their rooms, and no sweet-talking pimps with Cadillacs. That's not what I have found.
So you think that's false, that Washington police chief?
I think it's false, and I think it's a deliberate falsehood.
Well, let's talk about, we haven't talked about the proliferation in the United States of this. We've talked about a few individual cases. How widespread is it, and what are the numbers we're talking about?
Well, we know this, for instance. This is a standard. 500,000 kids run away or are thrown out of homes every year in the United States, and the majority of them are boys. Another thing that the President's Commission on Obscenity found, this is the commission that Richard Nixon repudiated, it mentioned in passing that child pornography was a phenomenon of the abuse of children, and then went on to say that for every female prostitute of any age in the United States, there are 9 boys underage who are prostitutes. That is a finding which is debatable and is a speculation, but it went unnoticed. I think, though, that if you get in a car and prowl the streets of the capitals of this practice, Houston, New Orleans, Atlanta, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and to a much lesser extent, Austin, our state capital, and Washington, the nation's capital, you'll find that boys are the ones hustling more than the women.
Mark, some of the research that you did in Austin here that started off your involvement in this issue indicated that there was a possible ring of homosexual boys in Austin. Could you tell some of the facts on this case?
Well, my interest in this whole issue originated when, as a reporter for the Daily Texan, we heard through the grapevine that a pharmacist here in town had been busted. And I don't remember the original charge. I'm not sure if it was
abuse of a boy in a home.
I guess it was abuse of a, that's right, abuse of a boy in a halfway house. Well, the thing that interested us about the case was that the police had later found in his home a file, an index file, of anywhere from 200 to 500 names of young boys around the Travis County area and counties accompanying Travis County. And it had their names, phone numbers, parents' names, in many cases, sexual statistics on the personnel, height, age, weight, and in some cases preferences. And that sounded like an astounding thing to us, that there should be somebody traveling around, and what he did was he would hang out at high schools and offer the drugs that he had available as he was a pharmacist in exchange for sexual favors. Well, we followed that up, and somewhere down the line of judicial scrutiny, the evidence was lost or disappeared or was unable to be retracted. And it complicates from there, but that's how we got.
Well, Anderson, his name was Anderson, Robert Anderson. He was found guilty of one charge and sentenced to 2 years in prison. And then he skipped. He was still not incarcerated. He skipped, and he's never been found again.
Was there any indication that he was involved with other men who were participating in these favors? In other words, what would the point of him keeping these cards be, unless there was some sort of business or organization?
He was an agent. He was an agent, and he had quantities of drugs. Mark didn't mention that he listed next to the name of each boy that boy's personal drug preference. And he also had a very large quantity of muscle relaxants to administer to boys to make sex easier for the men.
Not only that, but there was also the names of several well-known business men in the Texas community that, for obvious reasons, were contacts.
Okay, what about, you talked about Boy Scout groups and boys' homes. What about these?
Well, a boys' home is an ideal place if you want to get in on an operation and get hold of some vulnerable kids. It's an ideal place to do it. In San Antonio this August, 2 men who were supposed to be Catholic priests were arrested for sodomizing 50 boys, ages 3.5 to 14, that year, and they had had several hundred boys in the past 3 years. They're having sex with the boys on a regular basis. That was why they established the home, to get at little boys. In Dallas, a place was closed down the year before. In Houston, Jimmy was in a home in Houston for a while, and he was raped by his caretaker. That place was closed down. In Houston, there are only 42 beds available in all the homes for boys in the whole city, and one of the homes that's still open was previously investigated, and arrests were made because of attacks on the boys. It's very common. It's very hard to trust any place that presents itself as a home for boys. And one of the tragedies of that is when somebody opens one that is clean, like Covenant House in New York City, operated by Father Bruce Ritter, the first thing that happens is there's a smear campaign against it, and everybody says it's dirty too. So if there's a clean one, it gets a bad name. The object is that to make it impossible to tell the good ones from the bad ones.
I guess the Boy Scout people have this problem too, don't
yes, we've mentioned a couple of Boy Scout rings. That doesn't mean that the Boy Scouts are an organized group to feed pederasts.
What about judges and police?
Judges and police are in high-pressured
And they're
professions
involved
too.
in some of these too, then.
To my knowledge, the police are involved less as practitioners of this than the other stressful professions, by far.
We mentioned...
I should have mentioned the clergy. With all regret, the clergy is highly susceptible to this. Real priests, not just bogus priests like those in San Antonio.
You mentioned some of the worst phenomena here, these mass murders in Houston and in Chicago. Does this connect with Atlanta in any way? There's been, as you know, mass murders of all these black children in Atlanta. And as I recall, the FBI, when they initially got in the case, after they made this a federal case, Reagan, or I guess it was Bush, went down there, the FBI came out with a report that indicated that there may be sex abuse of some sort in the death of these children. Then it seemed to be pretty much dropped after an initial play in the media. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes. The first indications that leaked out that maybe the kids who were victimized in Atlanta, murdered, were actually boy prostitutes who went to the people in the cars to make a contact, came out in February. And then national cable news network and ABC News tried to mention this as a possibility. It's a very delicate thing. It's almost an insult and affront to the black community to say the angels of Atlanta were really prostitutes, unless you believe, as I do, and unlike that law professor I quoted, unless you believe they're victims. They're not responsible for what is happening. They are being used and abused. But the public reaction was chilly, so the networks dropped it. They revived it in April and dropped it again. I have headlines here, quotations from news broadcasts about the boys possibly being hustlers, and that fellow who has been arrested and indicted being a photographer procurer. Among the mothers of the first 10 kids, those women who went public and talked about their predicament, is one who said to the wire services in an interview, "I'm afraid my son was involved in prostitution. I'm afraid that that's what got him killed. I'm afraid it's the link to the whole series of murders," and no newspaper in America printed the wire service copy.
Isn't part of this whole phenomenon dealt with a business of pornography, child pornography, where pictures are taken of these acts, films are made? And this Wayne Williams, we know is a photographer, and we know he has training in electronics. He'd done radio work, he'd done recording work. So might he be involved in a film organization, and indeed possibly even a snuff organization? There's been some evidence about snuff films where people are literally killed on film, and that these are distributed, the films. So is there some possibility that that might be involved?
I think it's possible, and I think it's likely, but we're talking about an ongoing case, and I think we have to be very careful about what we say. In Houston, I have seen myself big vans that don't have cabs on them, and I've seen young kids go into the van and not emerge for an hour or an hour and a half, and sometimes with the door open, I've seen photographic equipment inside. A raid was made on a mansion in Houston, although the newspapers in Houston referred to it as a flat. It was a mansion. Inside that mansion was more photographic equipment than KLRN, KLRU possesses, and that's one of the biggest stations in the Southwest, bigger than Channel 13 in Houston possesses. Channel 13 played up the raid, but the news media besides Channel 13 didn't. It was as if 5 guys in a little studio were taking candid camera shots of kids. They were producing books in there. There was also an arrest in Houston in 1981 of a man who sold 20 different films, child pornography films, to somebody from Boston. Now, he was committing several federal crimes in doing that.
Right.
And among those films, although the newspapers would not print the information, among those films was that of an infant being sexually used by men, and a film in which somebody appears to have been murdered. That person hasn't gone to jail yet.
What about the bookstores and the the places where they show movies and stuff like this here in town, for instance?
I think that you don't find much evidence of this sort of thing in the bookstores, because it's the people who are trading and dealing with this kind of thing. It's a very clandestine operation, and having gone through an investigation myself, I know how absolutely impossible it is to trail this stuff. I mean, you're dealing with people who are not stupid. You know, they are in levels of power because they're intelligent people, by and large, and they cover their tracks, and they're not about to be dealing with them through the bookstores. I think maybe 5 years ago you could find that sort of thing, but now I think it's been pretty much cleaned up. Tom may have more.
Well, I went into a bookstore in Austin 2 years ago in daylight, and my experience is the difference between the operation in daytime and nighttime is the difference between night and day. Yet, in daylight, I first bought a magazine that had pictures of people of borderline age. They could have been 18, they could have been 17, and 17 is legal. And then I had the names of illegal publications. I first asked for a register that listed boys by description. It was a catalog, The Order of Boy. I asked for that.
In a bookstore?
Yeah.
You're in Austin?
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
It's a crime to print that, to reproduce it, to distribute it, to buy it, to possess it. I broke the law by saying, I want that, and the guy reached under the counter and handed it to me. Then I said, what about this? And he handed me that, and I said, what about this one? And he handed me one more. And I walked out of there with a lot of illegal goods. I was in the daytime. I understand that as of now, 1981, the same bookstores don't let somebody they don't know do that sort of thing, even at night. But I've been in places in Houston within the last several months. One in particular I can describe to you had 40 cubicles where supposedly men go in and put in quarters to watch dirty movies. And outside every cubicle was a little boy. I was approached both by little boys as if I were a man who might want a boy, and I was approached by older men who, in the dark, thought I looked young. That was on a weeknight, not on Friday or Saturday, in Houston.
When I started following up some films that we heard were circulating in the Houston area, I called an old friend of mine while I was investigating another case involved in this, because we heard that it had been viewed by the district attorney's office in Houston. This friend was a good friend who I'd known from bars, in a very social atmosphere, not a professional one. And I called him to ask about if he had heard anything about this film or viewed it himself, perhaps. He answered the phone. I said hello, and we chatted for a moment. I said, by the way, have you heard anything about this film? And he cut me off and said, I've never talked to you before in my life. Boom. And I've never talked to him again. And I've known this guy for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. As soon as I mentioned that film, it's like...
When Boys for Sale was shown on TV, it was shown first as a nightly series, and then there was a summary program. The biggest bank in Houston withdrew its advertising from the show and from the station because it showed that program. Wow. And the bank managed to get the other advertisers for that program to withdraw their advertising.
And if I might interject this just for a moment, because it ties into the power problems. I remember originally with the Robert Anderson, the pharmacist we talked about earlier, one of the items found in his apartment was a wallet, or checkbook, I guess, with a student's address and name on it. Well, we started to make some phone calls and try to contact this person. We finally got through to his father, and it turned out it was one of the major banks in Dallas. His father was the bank president. And we thought we had a hot lead going. And next thing we know, a very, I can't mention names here, but a very powerful law enforcement agency head called us. We were asking about this individual's name in Dallas. And he called us back and said, and it was so cryptic that it was unusual, he just said, all I can say is, forget Dallas. Like, don't touch it.
Mm-hmm. A Texas House committee has been charged with looking at the problem. 2 public hearings later, the committee has been unable to make any serious progress. Its budget was slashed from $80,000 to $15,000, hardly enough to do an honest probe. And the committee chairman admits to knowing of the problem in Houston, but says he's been told to back off.
When we started this committee, we asked for money to do an adequate investigation to determine just how serious the problem of child pornography, child prostitution, sexual exploitation is here in Texas, which I think is a proper thing for this committee to do. Now, that was the first indication that we had pressure on us. The second indication was when I appeared before the House Administration Committee, when they chopped our budget, and subsequent conversations with certain members that said, we have got to stop our investigation.
Why did they want you to stop?
I don't know why. I have no...
You plan to find out?
I plan to find out. I think it's serious that they were getting this kind of pressure.
The concluding program of Boys for Sale will emphasize the law enforcement and judicial performances, the handling of the subject by the mass media, and will provide a more intimate understanding of the lives of the children involved.
There is big business, organized crime. It's sophisticated. It's closely attached to the major financial, commercial, industrial, educational institutions of our society. It's run by the same people who run those. It's frequented by the same people who occupy management positions in those. It's not the mafia. It's an adjunct of clean business. It's serving the most respectable people we have in our society, the people who are the elite.
Alternative Views is a production of the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas, 78712. We would like very much to hear from you if you'd like to participate on Alternative Views in some way, or would like to see a previous program repeated. Please contact us.